Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called the 10 greatest albums in history. But when we're talking history, we're really talking about the last 100 years, and we're going to be looking at albums that have been created in the popular music realm, which encompasses jazz and experimental music and a whole host of stuff, not classical music. Now, some of you might say you've done this video before, Andy. But this, if you look at the title afterwards, in very small letters, it says decade by decade. So what I'm going to be doing on this video is I'm going to be going through the last 100 years, decade by decade. I will pick what I think is the most important, greatest and artistically worthy album from each decade. And then we will have, by the end we've got to that century, 10 albums. And then we can have a discuss about which one we think is the greatest one on this list, which I haven't made a decision about. So the reason I wanted to do it this way is because my lists tend to favour, with my own bias, I'm very aware of, albums that are earlier rather than later. So if I was to do the 10 greatest albums of all time, I doubt anything in the 21st century would come up. But this way we get two, and I've had to have a think about which ones I think are the best. I think these are the greatest. It's not my opinion and my favourites. That would be a different list, but it's what I think are the greatest. But of course, you may have a different opinion what the greatest is. And in between all that, there may well be an objective list somewhere. So there's an attempt to get towards that. As you see, I'm being very serious on this video. There's going to be no humour on this. It's going to be very, very serious. Because this is serious business. We're in top 10 territory, and we're going to work out what the 10 greatest albums are. Are you ready to go? Brilliant. Can I just go and get a drink? I'm not sponsoring them, by the way, but I will put the logo facing you. And like so many of you are now going to hate me because I'm drinking a bottle of Coca-Cola. But I have a little bit of caffeine, a little bit of sugar, and a little bit of capitalism in me. So let's stick that there, and let's start. So we are looking at the period between 1920 and 2020. This decade's not over, so I can't say. So that's the decade we're going to look at. Were there any recordings before then? Well, there were, which is the most important recording pre-1920s. It is without doubt the troublesome Livery Stable Blues by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And that was a collection of records they made in 1917. Some music company in New York thought it would be quite an idea to record this weird group that originated in New Orleans because they thought it might be a bit of a novelty to have some mad tune, really fast tune with loads of animal noises all over it. And they did not really realise what they were releasing onto the world. They were releasing jazz. The original Dixieland Jazz Band was a proper jazz group. It had a lineage in New Orleans that went back all the way to the 1890s. It was playing real New Orleans jazz. The reason why they got recorded wasn't anything to do with race. It was the fact the ODJB were in the right place at the right time. Freddie Keppard had been offered this before them and he wouldn't do it. And so I feel that when we get started, that one of the big problems with looking at music history in terms of identity is nobody wants to say that the Livery Stable Blues is where it all starts. The record companies realise that they can make a lot of records. I mean, this record sold 1 million copies. And so they're now looking at jazz artists. Then they start looking at blues artists. They're looking at country artists. And then the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which is basically a photograph of what New Orleans jazz sounded like, a certain wing of New Orleans jazz, albeit. And I've gone into this in great detail elsewhere. But the point I want to make here is that once those doors are opened, then other people walked in that door that were geniuses, and they took the recording medium and they changed it. And this happens in the 1920s, the first decade we're looking at. Now, there's two real contenders here in terms of albums, right? Because there's no albums back then. All we've got is single records. And the original description of an album was basically a collection of 78. So it's like a photo album, all right? So, you could go and buy like 5 78s. So this was originally created to get classical music out there, right? And so when we look at the 1920s, we're looking at collections of recordings. Now, we have the urban blues artists like Bessie Smith and Leroy Carr, Ma Rainey. That's some killer stuff there, definitely in the running. We have all the sort of white jazz, Paul Whiteman, Big Spider Beck, and all that type of stuff. The Wolverines, the whole host of people there. Fletcher Henderson as well with his early big band work. There's a lot of stuff going on. Jelly Roll Morton's very important recordings in the mid-1920s that really helped arrange jazz. But I think above all those would be the 1927 Bristol recordings of various folk artists that basically lay the foundation for country music, especially the recordings of the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers. But they are beaten. They're in second place. Number one is undoubtedly Louis Armstrong's Hot Fives and Hot Sevens recordings that went between 1926 and 28-29, where he took that New Orleans jazz sound and adapted it in every way possible to the recording studio. The Hot Fives and Hot Sevens were not bands out there gigging. This is one of the first bands created to go into the studio. This was like the Wrecking Crew in the 1960s. And knowing the limits and also the advantages of recording, Louis Armstrong starts to capitalize on all of that. He utilizes improvisation, he utilizes groove, he arranges, and he thinks about the space that recording gives you, either being up front close, you're in the background like that. He puts certain things up close. He organizes the improvisation and utilizes improvisation in a structural way that lays the groundworks for the big bands of the 1930s, which lays the groundwork for all popular music following him on. From that, he sings, he bends the lyrics, he uses sound effects, he sings in his own voice, which makes his records recognizable, and he becomes the first pop star because you can hear that's a Louis Armstrong. That's an essential quality. Everything that we value subconsciously, we're not aware of in popular music, in recorded popular music, most of it originates with these Hot Fives and Hot Seven recordings. And I haven't even started to cover every innovation that is on these. But beyond that, you have the brilliance of Louis Armstrong himself, who was a virtuoso musician like the world had never seen, that bamboozled the classical world. They think this guy's playing this incredible trumpet playing with this incredible sound, this incredible tone, but he's not working from a score, it's coming from himself. Louis Armstrong could read music, he understood theory. He wasn't some innate, person from New Orleans that had come up from the streets. I mean, he was that, but he was a sophisticated musician, and this music was highly sophisticated. And this is where this idea that popular music could be more than just a local folk form that the people like, is that you could actually have something that was high art. It all originates here with the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens, right? It's undoubtedly the greatest album, which you can go and buy it now as an album. There's a lot of them. It's like a big box set, or you can go and get the best of the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens. Anybody who's got a record collection should go and buy the best of the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens, right? Which is the one hopefully you've got up here at the moment. Go and get it and go and listen to it. And once you get past the scratchiness of these early recordings and start to listen to the genius of Louis Armstrong, you will be sold on it and you will love it like me when I first heard it, right? So that's the 1920s done. So you get the idea. I'm going to lay the groundwork and we can talk around it, and then I'm going to put forward what I think is the greatest album of that decade. Now, of course, the 1930s saw, after people like King Oliver and Louis Armstrong had taken jazz out of New Orleans, taken it up into the urban northern areas of America like Chicago, and then it had become very popular, and then it got started to be recorded, and we create the recording industry. And out of that, the sort of dance bands that existed in the teens, right, that were going around touring, started to take on jazz. Paul Whiteman's an example of this. Fletcher Henderson, in terms of black music, because obviously we still have these two forms segregated, even though underneath all that, these musicians are playing with each other. And there was great respect between these different types of bands. By the time we get to the 1930s, jazz has transformed into swing jazz. The rhythm section has changed. Louis Armstrong was basically dealing with a New Orleans front line, which is basically you've got a trombone doing the bass end, you've got a clarinet doing the top end and the trumpet in the middle, and they sort of weave their way through. At the front of a marching band, you can walk with those, and then you've got basically bass drum and snare drum behind you, bring it all up. By the time we get to the big bands, especially Count Basie, that rhythm section with Joe Jones, Freddie Green, that rhythm section brings in like the walking bass line. It transfers the time onto the hi-hats. We get a much stronger sense of a 4-bass swing. And then when we look at groups like Duke Ellington, Duke just raises the level of composition and utilizes improvising musicians within a high-level concept of composition that by the end of the 30s advanced to almost, whether it is classical music and he's doing operas and all sorts of things. This is where all the juice is. On top of this, we've got people like Charlie Christian pioneering electric guitar. We've got Charlie Christian being one of the first black musicians to walk in, a white band when he joined Benny Gunsman's band and laying the foundations for bebop. So this is all the stuff that's going on. I think when I look back at the 30s, beyond the fact that swing jazz emerges and that becomes popular music, right? That is where it starts. The swing bands come out. The records diminish actually in the 1930s for various reasons I won't go into here. And the radio becomes more important and people start to tune into these dance bands on the radio. And pretty soon they start to add vocals to it. And before you know it, you've got Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. Sinatra stood up in front of the Dorsey band. And we have the idea of the pop star. We have this idea of popular music. This has a huge youth following. Everything that we associate with rock and roll happened in the 1940s as a result of the big bands, right? But I'm not going to put a big band album on here because for me, the overriding thing that happens in the 30s is the great innovation of jazz, that popular music suddenly becomes as sophisticated, and in this case, more sophisticated in terms of the way I see the world. I definitely think this, more sophisticated than classical music. And this is embodied more than any other musician in the virtuoso genius of Art Tatum. So Art Tatum was a half-blind American pianist, born in, I think, 1904. He emerges in the 1930s and he's taken in jazz. He's also taken in classical music, especially sort of impressionist music. And he's taken in sort of the boogie-woogie pianists like Meade Lux Lewis and all those guys. And he's put it together in a form that is perhaps, till to this day, the most virtuoso form of music ever recorded. I mean, the internet is obsessed with virtuosity now. There's so many people doing impossible things on the internet. But still, I don't think they've surpassed Art Tatum. Now, in 1933, Art Tatum went into the record studio and he created a bunch of solo piano pieces, and they're the ones I'm going to put forth. And this appeared eventually in the 60s, I think, on an album called Piano Starts Here, which collects his 1933 recordings. But these came out in the 30s as 78 records. Pianists that heard it were astonished. They were convinced it was two pianists playing at the same time. Oscar Peterson became Oscar Peterson when he heard it, and many classical musicians saw that Art Tatum was doing something that was way beyond what any classical musician could do. And what was he doing? Taking popular tunes like Tea for Two and then breaking them inside out, you know, putting in incredible virtuoso runs that are like mathematical in their density. He would like change the harmony, he would change the rhythms, he would use metric modulation. He takes popular music and he just shows you what you can do. And this lays the groundworks for everything that's going to happen in jazz next. The bebop and the slavish adherence to chops. It all starts with Art Tatum, and I still don't think he's been surpassed. When I listen to him playing the piano, there's an attack with Art Tatum, which is cutting through on those 78 records back in 1933 that no pianist has ever had since. It's absolutely frightening. Again, if you own albums, right, and even if you don't like jazz, Piano Starts Here is an essential album. If you really want to hear what popular music can operate at in terms of the technical level and virtuosity, it's that album, 1933. So we now move on to the 1940s. In the 1940s, there was all sorts of problems, and there was a record ban in the early 40s in the States, and this sort of stunted the music industry at that point. You know, the war started, a lot of people got drafted, the big bands weren't able to get as many gigs, and the big bands sort of fall apart, and you see the big bands getting reduced down into smaller groups. There's always been smaller groups in jazz, but you see a reduction of that big band sound into what has become rhythm and blues, right? And here we also see the beginnings of blues, which started off as an urban form, you know, with a rhythm section and a band, but then we had this sort of Delta blues, sort of folk blues thing. Lead Belly had been discovered and had been a big success. But those blues artists have carried on, and in the 40s they start to make rhythm and blues records, which is the foundation of rock and roll, and then rock music. Sister Loretta Tharpe. Did I say that right? Sister Loretta Tharpe. That's not right, isn't it? God, Andy, you're getting so... Look, don't go down this. I want this video to be really good. I wanted to show my actual YouTubing skills on here without any funniness. I thought I've done too much funniness and too much silliness. Anyway, Muddy Waters and a few other people. By the end of the 40s, you've got people like Fats Domino and, you know, Ike Turner laying the foundations of rock and roll, rhythm, blues, all that type of thing. But I think in terms of music and genius, when we start to look at the quality, it's undoubtedly the revolution that is bebop that happens in the 1940s. Now, the central figure to bebop was called Charlie Parker. And Charlie Parker couldn't record through the 1940s because of this record ban that was going on. In 1945, that was lifted, and he went into the studio with this new music form fully formed. And on November the 26th, 1945, he did a session that may well be the greatest music session in history. In that one day, more masterpieces were created in those few hours than ever before or since, because he lays the groundwork with a band that features both Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis. And we get Billy's Bounce from that session, we get Now's the Time from that session, and we get Coco from that session, plus a load of others. Now, at this point, he was working on Candid Records and he was working on Dial Records, and I've got a 50-50 chance. I'm not too sure. I think this was on Candid Records. But now you can get box sets that contain this 1926 session. If you Google Charlie Parker, November the 26th, 1945, you will see it will pop up and you will be able to grab that. And whatever album I've got up here that represents that, because I don't know the name of it, I'm basically saying that session there is the greatest album. If we see an album as a collection of tunes, that session there is the greatest of the 1940s, undeniably. Nobody went near it, you know. I would put Coleman Hawkins' Picasso, that he recorded a few years later, as being in the run-in, some of the Lester Young recordings at that time. There's a whole host of incredible recordings, Birth of the Cool, some of the Lenny Tristano stuff. It goes on and on. But there is nothing like the genius of Charlie Parker in jazz. There is no soloist in jazz that quite occupies the same space as Charlie Parker. If you think of Louis Armstrong basically owns trumpet playing, right? And anyone else who plays the trumpet is basically borrowing their sound in somewhere, or in some aspect they're playing Louis' instrument. If you play electric guitar, you're basically playing Charlie Christian's instrument. These are the guys that define the instrument. And in terms of alto saxophone playing, right, he owns it. Charlie Parker owns it. And it's just pure genius, fiery, out of control, and yet beautiful and perfect genius in every single note. There's very few musicians that are on that sort of level. And that sort of virtuosity we hear in Charlie Parker is coming out of Art Tatum, really. He was from Kansas City, the same as Count Basie. And a lot of the players there in the 1930s used to play a sort of double time style, which Charlie Parker adopted. But, you know, when you read the interviews with Charlie Parker back then, he was played 12 to 15 hours a day. He was taking that double time feel approach and then just blasting it through all 12 keys until he assimilated it in every shape or form, you know, in 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions. And then it's the beginning of taking jazz and busting jazz out of being a popular music form. And this is the groundwork for all this creative stuff that has been allied to popular music since then, which would include free jazz, which would include minimalism, which would include progressive rock, which would include jazz fusion, electronic music, rap, hip hop, all the stuff that's on the edge that we associate with popular music but isn't popular. It's something else. It starts with the beboppers. The beboppers were cool. The beboppers wanted to have a stance. They wanted to be outside of mainstream culture, and so not only is this virtuoso and technically brilliant, it also has a standing up to the man attitude, which is really personified in the hardness of the riffs. And those riffs, especially now at the time, that's a riff, right? It's a killer riff. And that's where your heavy metal comes from. It's all here in that session in 1945 when Charlie Parker walks in and goes, "This is what bebop is." People were coming back from the war at that point. Musicians had been off to war. They were coming back. And there's a brilliant interview with John Hendricks where he sat on some boat coming back from the war. And I think they start playing Now's the Time. It's a Charlie Parker tune. He can't believe what he's hearing. It's a clarion call. And it was a clarion call for black Americans as well, to go, look at this. This is so sophisticated, but it's not come from the academy. It's transgressive. It represents an other world. And this was a very important thing. This Charlie Parker's stuff in the 40s is so incredible. You put all this together, as we go into the 1950s, the obvious revolution in the 1950s is rock and roll. Of course, we've got the trad jazz resurgence here in the UK that ends up in skiffle, which is going to lay the groundworks for rock music in the 1960s. We also have a lot of the third stream stuff emerging. We've got West Coast cool jazz. We've got Dave Brubeck, going to the top of the charts with Take 5. We got Kind of Blue, the biggest selling jazz album ever recorded. All that's going on, but we can't dismiss rock and roll. So what is rock and roll? Rock and roll is the conglomeration of a variety of American popular music styles that have their roots in genius black musicians. And in that, I would say, we've obviously got jazz. And what comes from jazz in terms of rock and roll is the band. It's the structure. It's the double bass, the drums, the electric guitar, the horn section, and the piano, the rhythm section, the breaks, the riffs. That's what's coming from there, through the big bands into the sort of rhythm and blues bands like Louis Jordan in the 1940s, Big Joe Turner. That's what you've got, that aspect of it. There's a little bit of gospel creeping in that has come through, the Bessie Smiths combining with sort of Afro-American Christian music and that tradition that now starts to emerge. And then you see that being secularized by people like Ray Charles in the 1950s. Very, very important. You also have country music. Now, country music's American music, and this is based upon all sorts of different music. It goes right the way back. Lead Belly's he's playing country music as much as he's playing the blues. Chuck Berry comes in and he takes country music with Maybelline and he combines it with rhythm and blues. That's a big thing that goes forward. Fats Domino, who's a boogie-woogie pianist, he comes in writing popular songs with a driving beat with that much more straight a boogie-woogie sound. That's the basis of rock and roll. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, not Loretta, Muddy Waters brings the electricity into the blues. Ike Turner then amps that up with Rocket 88. There's a whole host of records coming in. But as we know, and this is going to be contentious again, right? And I don't mind being contentious, right? These artists, right, are all black artists in America, and the racism means that this music's going on. It's been going on for, rock and roll wasn't made in 55 with Bill Haley in the comments. It goes right back to the 1940s, right? But in 1955, it explodes. And why does it explode in 55? Because those kids that were born at a certain point, the post-war kids, right, go into especially in America, in a world where there's a little bit more affluence than there has been before. And you start to get the emergence of the teenager. And the teenager is based around film as it is as much based around music. And you see the emergence of the teenager film. You get the James Deans. It probably starts with Marlon Brando. With the wild one, you get people like Montgomery Clift, you get the anti-heroes, you get these people that are on an edge, right? And that emerges as an idea. All this sublimates and combines in Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley is as though you've got a great American film star like Tony Curtis or Marlon Brando, wrapped him up in a whole bunch of country music and rhythm and blues. Now, the thing with Elvis wasn't a faker, right? He had grown up with this. So when he starts hanging around Sun Records, which are making all these incredible records by, Howlin' Wolf and all this incredible stuff, Mystery Train and Carl Perkins, and all this stuff's going on down there. And Elvis is down there, and Elvis could do it. He could sing. He's a monster, but he could do other stuff as well. He can dance and move, and he can look like a film star. And Elvis Presley, to this day, is unsurpassable as a pop star. Who else is that good looking, is that charismatic, is that iconic? And so when he started to play this American rhythm and blues country gospel-y music, which he starts to do in 1955, 56, I think his first record is 1954, he starts to put these records out. People were shocked. My friend Kevin Gammon knew someone who saw Elvis Presley in America in 1955, and he tells me the story that this guy had gone to a fun fair. And he said he basically turns up and he's walking around the fun fair and there's a flatbed truck there and Elvis is playing to the fun fair on the back of this. People are seeing him, and they're running home, getting their families and bringing them down. This is where youth culture, the teenager, the conglomeration between film, Hollywood, rock and roll, showbiz, all of this, merchandise, it all comes together on Elvis Presley's first album. And this album here, this debut album with this iconic album cover, is possibly the first iconic album that we've covered here. So this is like the album you have to have. And if you're an Elvis Presley fan, you know that he may have done all that schlocky stuff later on. He may have gone and made all those films, with Anne Margaret, and and he might have been like, Hollywood might have like taken away the real grit of Elvis. Then he makes his comeback in 1970, amazing, but then he falls into the business, it's Las Vegas sort of fat, shadow of his former glory. But here, with this album, is the juice. Scotty Moore's incredible guitar playing, the reduction of the tunes down to such simple arrangement. Some of these tunes are just basically bass guitar and vocal. It's incredible stuff. I know people are going to say that Little Richards is the real deal. They're going to say that, Chuck Berry's the real deal. They're going to go through all those people and they're going to get all angry and say Elvis Presley was an appropriation. Well, perhaps he was. But when we look at the history of popular music, right, we get to the next decade, that's what you're going to see over and over again. This is where it starts. You have to just take it on. If you approach this ideologically, you get all upset, right? Because these musicians were great. Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent. That Coke's coming back on. Now I need to top myself up here. All incredible in their own way, but there was never everyone quite like Elvis, was there? Right, 1960s next. So we have rock and roll. And rock and roll comes out, teenagers' music, They're watching all those rock and roll films and they, like Black Ball Jungle or the James Dean films, and they're getting all like, countercultural. And then suddenly we have these teenagers, they drive around their cars, and getting drunk and all this type of stuff. But that starts to smooth out. By the time we get to the 1960s, it's smoothed out. Next thing, we got Frankie Lyman, the Teenagers, Pat Boone. And it's all gone away. It's all been replaced by a bit of doo-wop and all this stuff's going on. And but underneath that, there's something else going on as well. It's like this sort of countercultural thing. The teenagers have grown up. And they're searching for something else. They're searching for something that really represents a feeling of wanting to change society, all right? And we could track that through. In America, we're going to get bands like The Doors emerge, really countercultural. Like The Doors are like some sort of drugged up bossa nova band, really. It's incredible stuff. Here in the UK, we're going to have the Rolling Stones and we're going to have the Kinks. We're going to have the Beatles, we're going to have that sort of electric guitar sound. We're basically going to move from rock and roll to rock. Now, undeniably, the guy that is the central figure and the guy that changes rock and roll into rock is Bob Dylan. And he does this over 4 albums, right? In 1962 brings out an album, which is basically him being a middle-class white Jewish guy that's into this new emerging folk scene that's in the coffee shops. And he comes out, but the thing is he's got an edge because he's a big Woody Guthrie fan, you see. And he's actually gone out and met Woody Guthrie, and he's been very impressed by the way Woody Guthrie has used American folk forms to get political, right? And on his first album, he basically does a whole bunch of cover versions, but he's pulling on those cover versions with this revolutionary idea in mind, right? Now, this album's not a big success, but it's very important because it lays the groundwork for his next album called Freewheeling that comes out in 63 or 64. And on this, he takes that acoustic folk form and he starts to write songs about the way that generation feel. And when you put that album on, the first track comes out on Blowing in the Wind, with that one track, he personifies what's going on at that time more than anybody else. And this turns him into a living legend. He's a living legend now because of that, because he was able to articulate that. He was able to go beyond just singing songs about driving around in cars and chatting up girls and getting drunk, you know, all that type of thing. And he was able to really personify what that generation felt. But there was a missing jigsaw piece because, of course, all this rhythm and blues is happening. The electricity's been brought in by people like Muddy Waters, and we've got rhythm sections and we've got groove and soul and we've got all that going on. And on the following album, Bringing It All Back Home, he then combines this style with an electric band, basically inventing rock music and opening the door for absolutely everything. He then follows this up with Blonde on Blonde, which really nails the idea of the album as an art form. He gets long ranging. You get a whole sidelong track on there. There's improvisation. I can't stick that album, but I know the power of it. But these first 3 albums, I am growing to absolutely love. I'm starting to really understand. And Bringing It All Home, again, put the album on, and Subterranean Homesick Blues starts up. And in that, we have rock music, we've got funk, we've got rap, we've got hip-hop, we've got the whole lot. Is Subterranean Homesick Blues the greatest song of the rock period? Is it the beginning and end of everything? Isn't it because from the day I first heard it 40 years ago, I've loved that. I've always said I hate Bob Dylan, but I love that tune. It just grooves and it swings and his voice is incredible. All one note. It's like James Brown who's singing soul songs out of gospel. He hears that and he goes, oh, what are we going to do there? Frank Zappa hears it. He goes, oh my God, I can sing in my own voice. I can be experimental. The Beatles hear it. Stones hear it. This album, Bringing It All Back Home. And think of that title. Right, it's as though it's looking backwards. It's as though it's conservative in its title. It's saying, let's bring it all down to us. What is home? This is a massive artistic statement that opens up the idea of what rock music can be. And I am a big fan of rock music, and I assume a lot of you are. And that is why, without that, there's no Sgt. Pepper, there's no Pink Floyd, there's no King Crimson, there's no Cream, there's no Hendrix. There's none of it. It starts and ends there. And once you've got those electric guitars in, and once you've got those straight rock beats in, and once you've all got that, it's just going to get heavier and heavier. And throughout the 60s, this idea of heaviness is emerging. And what's heaviness about? Heaviness is about, it's about revolution and sticking your finger up to the man in sound form. That's what it is. And it goes right back to Howlin' Wolf and all those people that would growl at you and frighten you. Popular music's not here to just tell you about, asking how much a doggy in the window is. We're now going to scare the pants off you. And this is really going to become the overarching thing. And when I got to a teenager, when I was at 11, 12, going into 13, I only wanted to listen to one thing, and that was music that scared the pants off me and would scare the pants off my mum and dad. I want something that was heavy, right? Undeniably, when we move into the 70s, with all that progressive rock going on and disco and punk, all that stuff that's happening, all the experimental stuff, krautrock and all that type of stuff, I can't help but think that the most important overriding form in the 1970s was heavy. It was heavy. And that's what I listened to. I listened to King Crimson, I listened to Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, you know, I listened to Judas Priest. That's heaviness is where it's at. The prog bands I liked, if they weren't heavy, I didn't like them as much. The jazz fusion bands, if they weren't heavy, I didn't like them so much. I like stuff to be heavy. I like to riff. There's one overarching genius band, isn't there, when we start talking like this? It's Black Sabbath. I really think now that, I mean, I love the Mahavishnu Orchestra, but the most important, greatest band is Black Sabbath. And in the same way that Louis Armstrong owns jazz and trumpet playing and Charlie Parker owns virtuoso bebop playing, heavy metal, heavy rock, whatever you want to call it, is owned by Black Sabbath. It just comes out of them anyway, right? And this is why no heavy metal band that came in afterwards sounds like Black Sabbath in any way. None of them have that bubbling, free, like, bass sound of Geezer Butler. None of them have that sort of tight, you know, funky, all over the place jazz drumming of Bill Ward. Or, you know, Tony Iommi's plastic fingers, you know, down-tuned, doubled up sound. And, of course, Ozzy Osbourne's incredible voice, which no heavy metal singer has ever emulated, because it can't be emulated. Without a doubt, their greatest album is Paranoid. I really wanted to put Sabotage on there. I could have put Masters of Reality. I could have put Volume 4, which is my favourite Black Sabbath album. I could even put Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. We can pick any of those. Pick what you want, but I think the full majesty and might, and also a lot of the groundworks for progressive rock as well, are made on that Paranoid album. Paranoid could well be the greatest progressive rock album of the 70s, second only to Close to the Edge, if you want to call it a progressive rock album. In 1970, well, bloody well was. There's no two ways about it. It was. So that's what I've got for the 1970s, is Paranoid by Black Sabbath. Right? The 70s seems to be a story of these bands getting more and more sophisticated, more and more out there, you know, ending up with like Dark Side of the Moon, Tubular Bells, and all that whole prog thing that we love on this channel. But we also see the movement to a more visceral type of rock music that relates more to rock and roll, which is punk, but taking out the sort of blues elements of it and reducing it down to something that's much more working class. And we see that emerging with British punk. We also see the sort of just free, happy equivalent of rock and roll in the 1970s, which is disco. And disco is going to lay the groundwork for electronic music and all sorts of things. This is what's going on throughout the 70s. When we get to the 80s, the overriding things that have now come in that are very important would be drum machines, sequencers, early digital sampling, groove, dance music, and rapping, hip-hop skills, scratching. And I think we have to have an album in the 1980s that embodies that. You know, be lovely to, you know, to have a Duran Duran album here. I don't know. What else could we have? Maybe Thriller by Michael Jackson. I don't know. For me, overriding the most important album in the 1980s is It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back by Public Enemy, which was Public Enemy's second album. The first album is a raw and ragtag affair, and it's revolutionary. But on the second album, Def Jam Records, Rick Rubin producing, pulling in elements from thrash metal, rock, funk, Parliament, Funkadelic, Dylan, protest songs, you know, politics, all of that is in there. And it's like an explosion. Public Enemy it's just, everything is personified on that album, which then takes all these music forms, which at this point are like novelties. They're novelty forms, much like jazz was in the 1920s. And Public Enemy and NWA and Ice-T, not other people, but more than anybody else, it's Public Enemy. And Public Enemy cross over to rock bands, you know, and they cross over to dance music, electronic music. Without a doubt, Public Enemy turned this music serious. And it lays the groundwork to what the music we have now in popular music. That is all there. And the COD nod to sort of political, challenging, popular music, which today is just people being as safe as they possibly can, was dangerous at that time. And when Public Enemy came out of this, they felt like a threat to, you know, our sort of white middle class, you know, America and the UK. You know, when they stood there with their army at the back holding guns, you know, and a target and the name Public Enemy, which went back to sort of the sort of fugitive of the 1930s, like, you know, Bonnie and Clyde and Machine Gun Kelly and all that type of stuff. Incredible. That's what I got for the 1980s. Right, so Public Enemy come in. We then have dance music emerging, then we have jungle, drum and bass. Hip-hop goes into sort of the jazz hip-hop of the 1990s, but it also turns into trip-hop and electronic music. Electronic music starts to take a real hold, but we've also got the emergence of grunge, and we have the emergence of indie music. We get the sort of moving away from the hair bands with bands like Nirvana, and in the 90s, we then get bands like Radiohead, Rage Against the Machine, Linkin Park. All this stuff is what we've got bubbling in the 90s. The early 90s was a very creative period. For me, if we take indie music, if we take the sort of indiness of grunge, but then look at electronic music, dance music, electronica, some of the avant-garde stuff that's coming out like Ortekra and Aphex Twin, for me, there's one album that pulls all that together and is on a genius level because it's been made by a genius pop star called Björk. So I'm going to put one of the Björk albums forward to being one of the greatest albums of the 90s that really exemplifies all this. And for me, it has to be Post. Post is her second album. It's way out, it's heavy, but it's actually quite accessible as well. And it does everything Björk's going to do. And it seems to personify that creative post-dance music, electronic world in popular music in the early 90s, right? There's a little bit of Radiohead, there's a little bit of rap in there with what she's doing, hip-hop, there's a whole bunch of stuff. So that's what I've got for the 90s is Björk. And I think this is... with this, I've tried to come up with absolutely brilliant albums. Each of these albums I would say that I've put forward are flawless in themselves. They're not just influential, they're flawless, they're brilliant. You can go and buy yourself an Aphex Twin album and you might find that's all a little bit difficult and up its own bum in a way. You know, you could go and buy a Rage Against the Machine album, but that's really a sort of an aspect of heavy metal and heavy rock combined with rap. Björk seems to go across all those areas. For me, she's one of the great artists of the 90s and she personifies the last gasp of absolutely sublime popular music. Incredible singer as well. So that's what I've got for the 90s. So now we go to the 2000s, and 2000 to 2010 was really, really hard for me. And I was looking at all these albums that are coming out because now the music industry is now starting to fall apart. The album is becoming less important. Downloading's becoming important, you know, digital distribution, but also popular music has moved on and it's no longer based around bands anymore. It's based around individuals and the music industry is involved and the statements aren't so great. You know, when you look at the rock bands, you start to go, well, shall we have Arctic Monkeys? Yeah, I can't have them on. And so it became really difficult. And our first album I decided to put in was Kid A by Radiohead, which was the second album. It was the album after their great masterpiece of the 90s. It could have been in the 90s because my other 90s considerations was like, was Radiohead's OK Computer or maybe Grace by Jeff Buckley. Now, these are genius albums, but I don't think they just personify that decade like post-Björk. And Kid A sort of personifies the same thing that Björk did in 1994 in 2000. It's like they've now moved away from being a sort of indie rock band and they've embraced electronic music. Björk had already done that. So although Kid A is my favourite Radiohead album, Amnesiac as well, I wish I could put those two, I wish they released that as a double album. That would be the greatest album of that decade. But I have gone with a very esoteric album because I think as pop music took over and the sort of electronica revolution of the 90s died away, there was a statement in that decade that was absolutely incredible, right? And I'd like to represent it here. I'd like to have, this is the wild card on the list. So that's, for the decade of the 2000s, I have Just a Souvenir by Square Pusher. Now, Square Pusher was a sort of post-drum and bass artist using an intense amount of sequencing and programming. He was also a virtuoso jazz bass player. He also plays all the instrument and he's a great drummer. There's as much Jack DeJohnette in his drumming as there is like drum and bass. There's as much Jaco Pastorius in his bass lines as there is, you know, sort of the whoop whoop of jungle music. He brings together a lot of avant-garde things together. And his albums are very interesting. Just a Souvenir, I think you could say, is the greatest jazz fusion album of that decade. It's an album that if you're into jazz fusion or prog, you have to go and listen to. And I can't describe it anymore. Well, I can describe it. It's like insane electronica mixed with like tumbling drum and bass, which is programmed to the level that it almost sounds like a Jack DeJohnette or Elvin Jones or Tony Williams is coming at you. It's full of incredible soloing and his virtuoso bass playing, which is off the scale. The production is weird and strange and wonderful, and never do you feel like he's just showing off. This is one of the most important jazz albums, prog albums, and I've never mentioned it before. And the reason is because the albums that I'm a massive Square Pusher fan. I could tell you all sorts of things about Square Pusher. I go right back to the beginning, or at least when he brought out Feed Me Weird Things. And Feed Me Weird Things and Hard Normal Daddy are the albums that I just worshipped. They're very close to me. And then he brought out Music is Rotted One Note, which is sort of his electronica take on Bitches Brew, I suppose. And then he started to bring out much more straight sort of techno-y albums, and I lost track. And then I went back to check out these albums, and I put this one on, Just a Souvenir. This is mind-warping. So there's a new thing here that I want to champion as well, and it's that. Right, so we are now up to 2010s. Well, where are we in this last decade, right? Now, originally I thought I'll put, you know, To Pimp a Butterfly, which came out in 2015 by Kendrick Lamar. I love that album. And that seems to represent everything that's going on that is good musically today. But I changed my mind at the last minute because I think it is over. What we talk about here is over. Music is now moving on to somewhere else. And so when we talk about the album, when we talk about all the things I've just talked about here on this video, right, I think all of this, the beginning and the end, life and death, the whole of the story I've just told, starting off by, you know, Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith and all those people 100 years ago, it ends here. And it ends by one of the greatest artists of the rock period, David Bowie, with his last album, Black Star, made in New York, working with a bunch of jazz musicians, but creating some of the most incredible songs and creating what I feel is an album. It's an album, and it could only exist as an album. And the fact that David Bowie, who is one of the iconic, you know, sort of Hall of Fame rock people, who I never talk about on this channel. And the reason is because I'm not a massive fan of his albums. I like some of them very much. But Black Star, I absolutely love. From my point of view, it's his greatest album. It's the one I like to listen to the most because of the jazz influence on there. And I love that. But as well, for an artist of that period, a pop artist, an iconic pop artist, to have been able to utilize their own death on an album and do it so tastefully and wonderfully and sublimely, is the last great statement of this music that started with jazz, blues, country music and ended up with rock music, heavy music, popular music that your parents don't like, all the stuff that we're into here. It's the last gasp. So that is, for me, the greatest album of the decade, 2010 to 2020. Which am I going to proffer? Which am I going to put in the time capsule? It's going to be between Black Star and the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens by Louis Armstrong, the beginning and the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat, and I'm putting them both in together. You know, and what's really interesting when you look at those two albums, and what is the fundamentally underlying thing behind that, the great achievement artistically of the 20th century in terms of music. It's jazz. I'm sorry, it is. If you like this video, stick a like on it. If you want to see some more, please subscribe. If you want to support me, I have a Patreon, and the link is down below. If you want to support me financially with a tip or sort of a gift, I have a PayPal. tip jar. The link is down below. You also find links to my Substack where you've got like podcasts and written articles. I also have podcasts on Spotify that you'll be able to find there. And I have a Bandcamp with all my music on, and I have a new album out, which is called The Morrigan or something like that. I can't remember the title of my own album. This is how bad it's getting. But I hope I got through that with minimal mistakes. I only had one, memory lapse, so that was Sister Loretta Tharpe, which we got past, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Sorry about that. I think I did all right because I tried to do some proper YouTubing here. It's been a lot of comedy recently, but we're getting back to some hardcore top tens with a lot of cultural and creative philosophical background. I'm doing what I do. I'm going back to what I do just to show. I'm flexing my muscles. Just remember that. So you're going to get quite a few, there's going to be a few top tens this week. So you'll be loving that, won't you? You will be. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.